This is Village Manager Mike Brayman and Finance Director Melinda Malloy providing a fiscal year 2019 year-end financial review presentation. We have several topics to move through today, the first being the general fund revenue and expenses year-end 2019. We'll then move on to our water and sewer fund revenue expenses, and we will finish up with a brief discussion regarding our public safety pensions for both our police and fire pension funds. Melinda's going to discuss our revenues in each fund, and I will then follow up by discussing our expenses.
So the general fund revenues, it really is a story of permit activity. When we note here that revenues were up almost $1.8 million, of that 1.1 million was associated with permit activity. It was actually up 52% from where we had budgeted. But there's a story behind that permit activity that we will discuss in a slide later on. Before we get to that, we wanted to talk about some of our other revenue sources. So sales tax. This is a revenue that underperformed where we had expected. Now, some of this was anticipated as we built the budget due to the closure of stores like Carson's Department and Furniture Store and Treasure Island. But it still actually declined a little bit further than what we anticipated. It was about another 50,000 under budget, which is what the chart above you shows. Offsetting that, however, is local use tax. So local use tax is really driven by internet purchases. So the state collects this tax and it remits it back to us in a fashion similar to income tax. That is, it's based on population, our population, in proportion to the rest of the state. So the census actually is going to be very important to us in 2020 because it affects this revenue source as well as income tax. Over time, this revenue source has performed better for us as individuals make choices to make purchases online rather than going into brick and mortar stores. Income tax actually performed very well for us. In fact, it was almost 390,000 more than what we anticipated. So this has been referred to as the April surprise. As the Illinois Municipal League discussed it, exceptionally high final payments from 2018 individual and corporate income tax returns filed in the spring of 2019, the majority of which was of that growth came from non-wage income such as dividend and capital gains. So it's not something that we anticipate is going to be a trend that we see going forward. So as I had said earlier, permits is something that we needed to dive into a little bit further. Overall, permits performed much better than what we anticipated. However, our recurring permits were actually down 10% compared to last year. It's really the non-recurring permit activity, and that's associated with unusual home renovations or business activity that is occurring. Of that 1.2 million that came in 2019, half of it was due to business and half of it is actually tied to home activity. Real estate transfer was another revenue source that was somewhat of a mixed bag. Our recurring real estate transfer activity was actually down 4% compared to last year. We actually had 33 fewer transactions. It is our non-recurring real estate collections that were up approximately $100,000. So what was driving the activity in 2019 is that the conforming 30-year fixed rate started the year at about 4.5%, then dropped to 4% in the middle of the year and hit 3.5 by the fall and stayed in that area through the end of the year. So that's, you can actually see in this chart, the activity sort of dipping, but it's starting to come back at the end of the year, and it's actually going to have an impact in the early months of 2020.
So from the expense side, the good news is we see more green boxes with down arrows than we do pinkish boxes with up arrows. So we, once again, I believe this is at least the 7th consecutive year where we have spent less in the general fund than we had budgeted. And the next slide will provide some additional details, but overall we're about $650,000 under budget, with a decent percentage of that being from our contingency account, which we'll talk about. So from personnel includes wages, benefits, as well as overtime expense. We have an overall $126,000 savings. Overtime was actually over budget by $210,000, mostly due to police and fire department injuries, as well as some extended leaves, one being a military leave in the police department. That overtime expense was offset by turnover and hiring lag in each department and associated wage and benefit savings. So overall, despite the overtime being over budget, we still have a fairly sizable personnel savings in 2019. In terms of our contractual expenses, $173,000 under budget. There were a whole host of different line items that made up that savings, the most significant of which being on these slides. Custodial services we had rebid and realized a significant savings there. Some of that savings will not continue into 2020 as that contract was not as successful as we had hoped it would be, and we are proceeding with a new vendor moving forward. Tree pruning, we had very solid bids. Snow removal, there was very little contractual snow removal activity in 2019, thus driving down that cost. Commodities, about $41,000 under budget related to the snow removal. We were using less salt and spending less money in our commodities account. And then, as I talked about previously, the contingency was a large percentage of our savings. The contingency we budget for appropriation purposes. We don't assume spending that money when we're putting together our budget or putting together our tax levy. And the board may recall that throughout the course of 2019, we had talked about possibly a $200,000 or $215,000 special assessment from the North Suburban Employee Benefit Cooperative. They manage our HMO and our PPO health insurance products for our employees. That assessment did not take place in 2019. It's been deferred to 2020 and continues to be under review. The pool's reserves have improved slightly through the course of 2019, and we're hopeful that we won't have to make that special assessment in 2020 as well, but we won't know that until later this year.
So what does this mean for our fund balance? It improved. We said that we had more revenue than what we anticipated. We had less expense. We ended up with an overall reserve number of just over $15 million. So remember, we've talked about this before. When Moody's looks at us, and as they have again reaffirmed our AAA rating, they look for us to have at least 30% of our revenues in reserve. So that's roughly $10.5 million. At 15 million, we are actually at 43% of revenues for the year. This is actually going to serve us very well as we go into 2020.
So the next several slides will be water fund. There's less revenue accounts here, so we're going to move through these somewhat quicker than we did on the general fund side.
So in this slide, one of the things I think that you're going to see right away is that both with residential and with our water sales, you're seeing the arrows trending down. 2019 was another record year of above average precipitation, which has a negative impact on our water sales. Breaking it down a little further, if we look at residential consumption here, if you can focus on that black line, if you start back from 2018, you're going to see a continuing decline into all the way through December of 2019. Of note, in 2019, we did actually have a 7-cent increase to the residential rate, bringing it to $2.75 per CCF. I'd also like you to note that we had a software upgrade that allows for folks to sign up for paperless billing, as it also allows for individuals to see a graph of their 12-month consumption usage over time. Wholesale consumption was also down. We did have in 2019 our biannual rate recalculation, which resulted in a 5.5% increase to the rate, bringing it to roughly $1.47 per CCF. But the increase that we had, that 5.7, was almost entirely offset by the decrease in consumption that we had, which was actually close to 7% compared to budget. Of note, in 2020, North Main is actually scheduled to come on in June of 2020, and at that time, we will need to do a rate recalculation again.
So on the expense side, just like the general fund, we see more down arrows, meaning we are spending under the budget than over. A couple accounts to point out here. The contractual is about $70,000 over budget. That is largely tied to outsourced water main repairs, especially at the beginning of 2019 during some of the extreme cold weather. We had to call in reinforcements to supplement our staff, and that drove up that line item. Commodities is about $72,000 under budget. When we pump less water, as Melinda had just talked about, we use less chemicals, less energy, less heat, and that does impact that line item. And then finally, capital is $168,000 under budget. We did defer a vehicle purchase, which was split 50-50 between the water and sewer funds because as we worked through that process, the vehicle did not need to be replaced in 2019. And Nabil and his team at the water plant were also able to realize savings on a number of our capital CIP projects, largely in part due to the really great work of our water plant operators and mechanics who were able to take on some of the additional work themselves rather than outsourcing that, which helped reduce our expenses.
So what did this all mean for the water fund? If our water fund revenues were down roughly $460,000 and our expenses were actually down about $470,000, we actually added to our water fund reserves for the year. Our policy is that we are to have 20% of our annual operating funds in reserve. We ended the year at roughly 38%.
So the next couple of slides here, we'll talk about the sewer fund. Melinda will handle the revenues first, and then I will briefly discuss our expenses.
So this isn't surprising if we know that 2019 was an above year for precipitation, and we know that our sewer revenue is tied to our water fund usage, then we would expect to see our residential sewer charges actually decline. It's not the exact decline that we see in the water fund, and part of that reason is that if there is any penalty payments to be made when a utility bill is late, all of that money goes to the water funds. The sewer fund does not share in it. So when you look at those two revenue sources, the decline as a percent of budget, if it is going to be down, the sewer fund is going to show a larger decline than what the water fund does.
On the expense side, the largest expense here, and the reason we're over budget in the sewer fund, is our capital debt account. And this was over budget by about $1 million, driven by two components. The first being the sewer lining program. We were doing 2 years worth of projects in 2019 to catch up from previous years. So that is one reason that was over budget, but it was also under in 2018 to offset that. And then the neighborhood storage project. As we continue to move forward with phase 1A and our engineering design on phase 1, just the timing of when those dollars were going out the door pushed us over budget in 2019. And I know we've talked about this with the board before, and we'll continue to talk about it throughout the course of 2020. These are monies for the neighborhood storage that we're paying for out of cash reserves. And then when we issue debt later this summer, we'll be replenishing our reserve accounts to offset that cash advance. So the rest of our line items were fairly nominal in terms of over budget, or on the capital side, we actually had some significant savings. And that is operating capital, and that savings there, where we're about 70% of budget, is largely due to sewer main repairs that were not necessary as we reviewed the system, and we have separate line items for different types of repairs depending on the depths in the street. And when we don't have to go down a certain depth, we are able to save some budgetary expense there.
So again, trying to pull it all together, what does it mean? So we know that our revenues were down for the year, roughly $450,000. We knew we had some operational expense savings of roughly $250,000. So really our reserve actually did come in a little bit lower than what we expected. It is a similar policy to the water fund in that we recommend having 20% of our revenues. We actually ended the year at a 44% of revenues with the sewer fund. So We've talked about our major funds. It's also important for us to take a moment to understand what happened with our funding levels for our public safety pension funds. So those are made up of our fire and our police pension funds. 2019 was another volatile year. The Federal Reserve took steps to actually lower interest rates 3 times. But in the fourth quarter, the S&P 500 recorded its strongest finish since 2013. What that meant for us is that both of our portfolios produced a return of over 18% for the year. Ultimately, what this is going to mean is that our funded ratio, we anticipate, are both going to improve from their 2018 levels. We expect that the fire pension fund is going to end up roughly a little over 62% funded, and our police pension fund should have a funded ratio just over 65%.
And Melinda, can you briefly talk about our assumed rate of return and how we smooth those returns over a period of years, which will help provide some context for some concerns regarding the early first quarter returns in 2020?
Sure. So if dovetailing off what Mike is talking about right now, first and foremost in everyone's mind is sort of what is happening in the market right now in 2020 as we're speaking. But I'll go back to what happened to us in 2018. If we were looking at this same slide at the end of that year, both these funds had experienced a decline of over 7% each. As Mike was asking me, the rate of return that we assume for each of these funds is just over 7%. On an actuarial basis, what occurs is that each year our performance is smooth over a 5-year period, so that we are not taking all of the gains or all the losses in one year. It's actually split and smoothed over that period of time. So last year's underperformance is actually going to be split over the next 5 years, just like our overperformance that happened in 2019 is going to be smoothed over a 5-year period. Whatever ends up happening in 2020, again, the effect of that, we will only feel 1/5 of it as we go through the process of doing an actuarial report to come up with what our employer's required contribution is going to be.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. And that concludes our fiscal year 2019 year-end financial presentation. We will continue with financial reports throughout the month of April. January and February 2020 reports will be in the April 14th Village Board packet, and then we'll be looking to have a first quarter financial presentation at our April 28th Village Board meeting, along with additional monthly reports and updates as we move throughout the year. So thank you very much. We appreciate your time and attention.